Hello, everyone. I'm Olympia. Thank you for being here with me in this wonderful place called Lights Out Library. And I have a great story to tell you. Tonight, we're going to discover the history of yet another commodity, another element that has accompanied mankind for much of its history. And this one comes with a particular aura. It is very evocative. Gold. And I will tell you about other precious metals too, especially silver. From how they were discovered to their mining, their production, their status in different societies, what constitutes their value, and how they shaped aspects of human history. If you think of gold rushes, for example, and more, we have plenty of things to discuss. But before we do, I would like to thank you for your continuous support over a little more than 2 years. And I would like to tell you a bit about myself before embarking on our adventure. Some of you have asked whether I am an AI voice, and maybe some of you have just wondered, and this is understandable given the abundance of AI content at the moment. So I thought I would address that directly. I really am a real person. As a child, I lived in California, and during my teen years, I lived abroad with my family. I returned to the U.S. as an adult, first living in the Midwest and now in Texas. This might explain why some of my pronunciations are unfamiliar to some of you or sound foreign. I became interested in this type of content years ago, following the French Whisperer, who is the author of these stories you listen to. We teamed up to create Lights Out Library in 2023. Since then, it has been a journey for me, learning how to speak in front of a microphone, record and polish the sound of the episodes. We are still looking for ways to improve the podcast, so your feedback is always welcome. And rest assured that Lights Out Library is entirely scripted and recorded by 2 humans. We don't use AI in the process. But now, before we begin, if you wish to, you may close your eyes and allow yourself to forget about any worries. Assume a comfortable position. Maybe move a bit to settle. Take a long, deep, relaxing breath. And when you slowly exhale, feel your shoulders drop. Release the tension in your neck. Let your face soften and your jaw relax. Make sure your fingers are not clenched and that your legs are relaxed too. And allow the sound of my voice to guide you through this journey. And now, off we go. What comes to mind when we hear about gold is its shine, its rarity, and what it symbolizes. Gold is the symbol of wealth and power. Beyond its appearance, the primary reason for gold's high value has always been its rarity. But how rare is gold exactly? If we consider the earth as a whole, it is probably far less rare than one might imagine. Gold is a heavy element, and during the formation of our planet, it tended to sink toward the Earth's core, along with other metals. Of course, gold is still rare in the planet's core compared to other metals such as iron, But geologists estimate that around 99% of Earth's gold resides in the core, making it completely inaccessible. This would be several billions of metric tons of gold deep inside the planet. But between us and that gold, there are hundreds of miles of crust and mantle that are impossible to mine. The gold humankind has access to is the small portion that remained near the surface in the Earth's crust. The concentration of gold is extremely small, 4 parts per billion. Said differently, it means that on average, in order to find 1 ounce of gold, that's about 28 grams, you need almost 8,000 tons of earth soil. That's like a small cargo ship worth of earth to find 1 ounce. And that makes the mining of gold only valuable in places where it is more concentrated. This means that any vein considered economically viable to exploit must contain at least about 0.5 parts per million of gold. That is hundreds of times more than the average concentration in the Earth's crust. Based on these estimates, there would be about 400 million metric tons of gold in the Earth's crust, but most of it in concentrations that are too low or buried too deep to be collected. And that's why, out of these 400 million tons, humanity has mined and retrieved a very small fraction, not even 1 million tons. The United States Geological Survey estimates that throughout human history, around 200,000 metric tons have been mined. That's not even 0.1% of the gold in the crust. And however ancient gold mining is, about 2/3 of this gold has been mined since 1950. 2/3, which is telling about the efficiency of modern mining techniques and the size of gold mining operations since the 20th century. So, what has all this gold become? Of those 200,000 tons, about half exist in the form of jewelry. Around 1/3 is held as investment bars and coins, much of which is stored in the reserves of the central banks. The largest in the world has more than 8,000 metric tons, the U.S. gold reserves. They are stored primarily at the United States Bullion Depository in Kentucky, better known as Fort Knox. Other large national reserves of gold, about 2,000 or 3,000 metric tons, are found in Germany, China, Italy, Russia, and France. These are mind-boggling quantities of gold, but relative to all the gold that exists in the world, they are not as large as one might expect. I mentioned before that the U.S. reserves were at 8,000 tons out of 200,000 tons mined in history. That's only about 4 or 6% of everything, all the gold that was mined since 1950. So the reality is that gold ownership is scattered around the world, and many individuals own some, even if it's just a ring, a piece of jewelry, or even some gold leaf on something. ore, and that's the third use of gold that accounts for about 10% of the world's stock. Gold is used in electronic devices, in many of them, including computers and smartphones, that use a tiny bit of gold in their components. But what makes gold so attractive and valuable? In order to understand it, we need to start exploring its history and some of its characteristics. And this means going back thousands of years into the past, at the very beginnings of metallurgy. Gold may be rare, but it was probably the first metal used by humans because, unlike most others, it can be found free or native in nature, pure in its metallic form and not chemically bound to other elements. This is no coincidence. It has everything to do with gold's chemical properties. Unlike silver, for example, its shine does not fade. Gold does not rust because it does not react easily with other elements, especially oxygen, to form oxides. For this reason, although rare, nuggets of pure gold could sometimes be found close to the surface or in riverbeds. The shine likely attracted human attention early on, and because gold is malleable and relatively easy to melt, its melting point is around 1100 degrees Celsius, far lower than iron's 1500. It could be used to create artifacts very early in human history. The oldest gold objects that are well dated and that we know of are from the 5th millennium BC, and they were found in Bulgaria. That's centuries before the appearance of the first urban civilizations in the Middle East or in the Indus Valley. And it is even older than the oldest known large monuments, such as the Egyptian pyramids or Stonehenge. About at the same time, it is believed gold artifacts also circulated in Egypt in this very early period, called pre-dynastic in Egyptian history, and a little bit later in Mesopotamia too. Silver seems to have been discovered a bit later than gold, around 4000 BC, probably because it requires extraction from ores. Like gold, it is rather malleable and could be shaped without advanced tools. Stone tools could be sufficient. So these two metals were uncommon, which made them desirable. Their shine was attractive, especially gold. Silver may darken, but its shine can be restored by rubbing it a little bit, so it was also aesthetically appealing. The two metals could also be worked, and these initial characteristics probably established their value, their appeal. And this probably explains why ancient cultures gave them a special status, but with important differences. In ancient Egypt, gold became more than a metal. It was perceived from the early period of civilization along the Nile as a kind of divine substance and a symbol of eternity, of power and wealth. The very first artifacts made with gold, found in tombs, that include beads and ornaments like bracelets, date from 4500 BC. That is to say, this pre-dynastic period before Egypt was unified, and as its culture was still in its formation phase. By the Old Kingdom, in the 3rd millennium BC, gold mining in Egypt had become a state-organized activity, employing hundreds, and in some cases thousands of workers at specific mining sites. Gold was rather abundant in Egypt, in its eastern desert, and even more to the south in Nubia, which corresponds to the north of Sudan today. In Nubia, there were mines and also deposits in riverbeds. This abundance of gold in Nubia was the main reason why, along the history of Egypt, the control of this region, either with close commercial ties or direct occupation, was always a concern of the pharaohs. And much of the gold that ended up in the temples or in the tombs of ancient Egyptians came from Nubia. We know that gold in ancient Egypt was applied to all symbols of power: crowns, scepters, pectorals, the cobra that pharaohs had on their crowns. All of this was made of or covered in gold. Gold also had practical uses, particularly for highly luxurious objects such as plates or cups, reserved for a tiny elite and for special occasions. Gold powder could be occasionally used as makeup, as an ornament. Gold was also used in architecture and decoration. One of its earliest architectural applications was gold leaf applied to obelisks, tall, slender monuments topped with a small pyramid. This top could be covered in gold leaf or in electrum, an alloy of gold and silver, to make it shiny. The doors of temples and their interiors could be covered in gold leaf too, and the effect was probably striking when sunlight entered or when they reflected the flames of torches and braziers. And finally, the most famous use of gold was for funerary practices. Gold was central to burial rituals of the wealthy and powerful, and it was used in large quantities. The best documented examples of this that we know of is the tomb of Tutankhamun, discovered almost untouched in the 1920s. Tutankhamun was not even an important pharaoh. He died young and probably almost powerless in the hands of ministers and priests. And yet, there were hundreds of gold ornaments in his tomb. And on his mummy, just his mask weighed 10 kilograms. That's about 20 pounds of pure gold. This tells us of the quantity of gold the Egyptians had access to, but also of the symbolic value they attached to it, beyond its monetary value. As a result, the supply of gold remained a constant concern throughout Egyptian history. One clear indication of this is that the Egyptians produced some of the earliest geological maps we know of. The Turin Papyrus map, dating to the end of the New Kingdom in the late 2nd millennium BC, depicts the eastern desert of Egypt, showing its gold mines, quarries, and even workers' settlements. The importance of gold in ancient Egypt, combined with the extraordinary longevity of its civilization, had a profound influence on the Greeks and later the Romans. To them, Egypt was the land of the gold, a place whose reputation for wealth and magnificence endured long after it had declined as a great power. Now, one use of gold or silver that we may think of, but was not developed in Egypt, was coinage minting, the use of metals, including of lesser value like copper or bronze, to mint coins. Actually, the first gold coins we know of around the world appeared only in the first millennium BC, after the decline of Egypt, and it is believed the first kingdom to introduce standardized coins was Lydia, an ancient kingdom in Anatolia, modern Turkey. By the first millennium BC, metals were already used for transactions, but there were no coins. For large purchases, large transactions, metal ingots were transported, especially of silver, which was more common and less expensive than gold. Metal ingots in the Eastern Mediterranean and the Middle East had standardized shapes and weights, and it is believed that they were recognized as a kind of currency, but only for very large transactions or payment of tributes, because obviously one ingot of silver had an important value. This could not be used for small transactions between individuals at the time. A lot of state gifts or tributes were paid, expressed in silver or copper. But in the late Bronze Age, coins were introduced. So it started in Lydia, but in a few centuries the practice spread to the Old World, from China to the Mediterranean. Coins were a way to pay for transactions of a smaller size. They introduced a currency that was more usable. Now, a bigger difference with the modern coins or bank notes is that today we attribute value to these means of payment, not because they are made of precious material. We know they have worth because they can be used to pay for goods and services. They will be accepted, and their value derives from their daily use in the economy and the fact that they are official and issued by a single legitimate legal institution, a central bank. There is a government and an entire economy behind them. So, in other words, the value of these means of payment is based on trust in institutions and on the anticipated acceptance of them when we want to buy something in the economy. There was nothing like that in antiquity. No way of controlling that coins could only be issued by a single institution, because anyone could have replicated them. So the value of coins in antiquity was defined by and limited to the value of the metal they were made of. They had to be made of gold, silver, or lesser metals such as copper and bronze. And this is what determined their purchasing power and their acceptance. But that's something important for precious metals, because it is the moment when they start to evolve from ornaments, decorations, symbols of status, or religious sacred symbols to also become means of payment. Of course, they already had value for exchanges. They were traded before, and they could serve as tributes. But with the introduction of standardized ingots and later coins, their role in facilitating trade became much more important. States understood this especially well in the first millennium BC, a period when long-distance trade between different parts of the world began to take off. The Silk Road opened during this time, linking China to the Mediterranean and reshaping economies, cultures, and ideas along its entire length. India traded with the Persian Empire and China. The Phoenicians and the Greeks acted as go-betweens, intermediaries around the Mediterranean, developing international trade. So it is logical that coinage and this amplified role assigned to gold and silver appeared at the time. The oldest coin factory that produced bronze coins was excavated in China. It dates from the 7th and 6th centuries BC in the province of Hunan in central China. But for trade to run smoothly, it was necessary to standardize the means of payment. And that was a problem with these early coins from Lydia. They were made of electrum, this gold and silver alloy. But the percentage of each metal was not consistent between different batches of coins, so their value was uncertain, and it hampered their development. The first gold coins with standardized weight and purity were issued under King Croesus, the king of Lydia, in the 6th century BC. This gave people trust in the quality and quantity of gold in each coin. These coins were very convenient for merchants and governments, and this standardization inspired the Greeks and the Persians, the Achaemenid Empire, to do the same and create theirs. In Greek historiography, Croesus became associated with great wealth because on top of having a prosperous kingdom, he had access to important gold deposits in Anatolia, especially in a river, the Pactolus, which contained a lot of natural electrum, significantly more than what the Greeks had. It didn't save Lydia, though, because it ended up conquered and annexed by the Persian Empire. After his conquest of Lydia and victory over Croesus, the Persian Emperor Cyrus the Great introduced the first coins to his empire, replicating what was done in Lydia. And that was important because the Achaemenid Empire was by far the largest state on earth at the time. It was at a meeting point between China, India, and the Mediterranean, the more advanced parts of the world back then, and this contributed to a further spread of the use of gold and silver coins. There would be a lot to say about the history of coinage, obviously, and that could be a topic of its own. But we should bear in mind that for a very long time, from the first millennium BC until almost modern times, before the rise of paper money and international banking, gold and silver served as the main means of payment and the principal standards of international trade. This increase in long-distance trade made gold, in particular, incredibly valuable and strategically important throughout much of human history. For a long time, coins and banknotes issued by central banks had a value based on the right to convert them into a given quantity of gold or silver, something that has disappeared today since the 19th and 20th centuries. Gold has retained its status as the precious metal of reference. It has remained very valuable. But it has lost this function as currency for trade it had centuries ago. Its function as counterpart to coins and banknotes they are no longer exchangeable or convertible at the central bank. So nowadays, central banks retain gold reserves essentially as a way of diversifying their monetary reserves. It is a reserve of value, one of the things that guarantee their financial strength, that they are solid institutions and that the currency they issue is worth using because, among other things, they have a few hundreds or thousands of tons of gold in a safe that could be used. Now, in antiquity, apart from Egypt, in Mesopotamia, in Phoenician cities, in Greece, in the Roman Empire, or in Persia, gold was also used in jewelry and as ornamentation. Probably not as predominantly as in Egypt, but it was still the metal of choice for royal ornaments in temples. The most precious Greek statues, for example, were covered in gold leaf or made with ivory and gold, such as the statue of Zeus at Olympia, one of the seven wonders of the ancient world. This type of statue, which was made of wood and covered with plaques of gold and ivory, was called chryselephantine, literally of gold and ivory. Access to gold could vary dramatically from one part of the world to another. A striking example of this contrast in medieval times is the difference between Europe and the Americas before European contact or Africa. In medieval Africa, the most powerful state was probably the Mali Empire in Western Africa, which had access to large gold deposits that it traded with the Islamic world in North Africa and the Middle East. In the Americas, whether in Mesoamerica or in the Andes to the south, gold was far more abundant and accessible than it was in Europe. In all these places, gold was precious and had this special status due to its appearance and relative rarity, but nowhere as much as in Europe, which was starved of precious metals at the time, starved of gold and to a lesser extent of silver. Why was that? Because first, Europe did not have large and rich mines. There were some in Spain or in Austria, but they were not that productive. And second, because structurally, Europe lost its gold. It was a buyer of foreign products, especially spices, and also silk and other fabrics, ivory, gems, and that came from Africa or along the Silk Road and the Spice Road via the Middle East, and trade hubs like Alexandria or Constantinople. Europe had a few things to sell, but nothing as valuable or in high demand, and so structurally it was buying more than it was selling. This meant the difference had to be paid somehow, and somehow meant in gold and silver. So this drained Europe of its precious metals, and as a result, medieval Europe was probably the one region of the world with the least stock of gold, which also meant that the value of gold was very high as a result of its scarcity. And that contributed to turning gold into the ultimate symbol of wealth for Europeans of the Middle Ages. And the early modern era, too. When they came into contact with pre-Columbian cultures of the Americas, where gold was appreciated but not the object of the same craze, the pre-Columbians could just not understand that the conquistadors were so greedy for gold, and the thirst for gold they were showing. It made no sense to them. The one region where gold was not sought after was North America, among most Native American peoples. They just saw no value in gold because, even though it was pretty, it was also useless, not strong enough to make any tool or weapon with it, so they never bothered to collect it. There was so much more value in materials that combined a particular appearance and a utility, like obsidian, for example, which is not that common, and that they would have chosen over gold without hesitation. And this example of pre-Columbian North America, north of Mexico, reminds us that the value of gold is something totally cultural. It is useless. We may find it beautiful and shiny. There is probably something of this beauty that is spontaneously appealing to humans beyond particular cultures. Maybe because it reminds us of the sun. But still, gold has value only because of its aesthetic appeal and rarity. But it is not something necessary. It is not something useful at all, except nowadays in a few electronics applications. But still, that's not a vital kind of material. So its value is purely based on its desirability as a reserve of value or as a symbol of wealth. Does it mean that its value could drop one day? Theoretically, yes. But what makes gold a solid reserve of value is the weight of time and its appeal across multiple cultures. An appeal that may not be as universal as we just saw, but still very widespread across time and space. After thousands of years of high valuation, after gold has been associated with symbols of power in crowns and scepters and religious ornaments, the high value of gold is very well installed in culture, and it is constantly reinforced because it is visible as a symbol of wealth. And this is what gives it value rather than its rarity. There are plenty of things that are rare but not valuable. There is an apparently absurd enigma that goes like this: what is rare is expensive, but a cheap car is rare. Therefore, a cheap car must be expensive. The conclusion sounds absurd, but only because the initial proposition that rarity alone makes something expensive is simply false. Plenty of books were printed at only a handful of copies. Doesn't make them very valuable. Eggs with 3 yolks are extremely rare. 1 out of 25 million eggs. But it doesn't necessarily mean you would pay to have one. It's not worth it. Rarity is a condition of high value, yes, but not the one determining factor. It needs to be paired with something that makes the thing desirable. But the cultural value of gold is unique. It has the perfect mix of desirability for its appearance, rarity, and cultural appreciation. And that's why its value is so well established. The proof of this is how resilient it has been to the rise in the stock of gold. I mentioned at the beginning that 2/3 of the gold in circulation around the world had been mined since 1950. So, in other words, the quantity of gold in circulation in the world has tripled in less than a century. And yet its value has remained very high. If we think in terms of current currency, gold even appears to have skyrocketed in value. In 1950, for example, 1 ounce of gold was priced at 35 US dollars. Today, it trades above $3,000, but that figure is expressed in nominal, not inflation-adjusted terms. If we take into account inflation, which has also diluted the purchasing power of $1, its value has gone through large moves, but overall it has retained its purchasing power. So over this long period, gold has been a good hedge, a good reserve of value. In order to make people really lose interest in gold and see its value fall, it would take either the discovery of huge deposits or the emergence of another more attractive reserve of value that would make many people try to switch to something else. Or, in the very long term, there could be a cultural shift that would make the accumulation of something material, a physical quantity of gold, undesirable. None of this seems to be about to happen, so the value of gold still looks good. Now returning to pre-Columbian America, for cultures in Mesoamerica and South America, gold was still appreciated and sought after. The Aztecs regarded it as the product of the gods, a substance that would have arrived on Earth directly from the divine dimension. In South America, the Incas also had large quantities of gold mined in the Andes in Peru and Bolivia, and Colombia was another place where gold was abundant. You have heard of this myth of El Dorado, the supposed city or land hidden somewhere in the Americas that would have been made entirely of gold. This myth emerged in the years following the Spanish conquest of Mexico and their first expeditions to South America. This name, El Dorado, is derived from the name given by the first Spanish explorers when they saw a ceremony of a people called the Muiscas. In what is now modern Colombia, the king of the Muiscas would cover himself in gold, in a gold powder, before walking into a lake to wash the gold off as an offering to the gods. Whereas at the same time, his followers threw golden objects into the lake. They call this king, or the ritual, El Rey Dorado, El Dorado, the Golden One. And as the rumor spread in Spanish colonies and then in Europe, El Dorado became a place. Of course, it was never found, even though various expeditions searched for it in the 16th and 17th centuries. But the Spanish did find a lot of gold in America, and their insatiable greed at the time is also the consequence of this particular status that gold had acquired in medieval Europe as the ultimate symbol of wealth. In that respect, the conquest of Mexico and the quantity of gold seized there and sent to Spain was a huge success that was repeated in South America with the Incas, or to a lesser extent in Colombia with the Muiscas. And the huge quantity of gold and silver that arrived in Spain in the 16th century, first the loot and then the product of mines, was also a game changer for Europe as a whole. From the place where gold was the scarcest in the world, Europe became the place where there was the biggest quantity. At the same time, The historical drain on European gold and silver due to trade with the rest of the world. What I mentioned before, this disappeared because from the 16th century, European merchants were now taking control of oceanic trade. Spices, silk, gems, and soon colonial crops like sugar, cotton, tobacco, dyes. First the Portuguese and then the Dutch, the English, the French. They took control of this trade, and after that came the Industrial Revolution. As a result of these changes, it was now Europe that sold more than it bought. All of this reversed gold flows and made Europe very gold rich by the 18th and 19th centuries. All through these periods, another aspect of the appeal of gold, and one that lasted well into the 18th century, was this ancient discipline called alchemy. Alchemy was a broad tradition that existed since antiquity, from China to Europe, including the Islamic world or India. There were different approaches to it, different schools and different understandings of what it was about. But their common thread is that alchemy was about the alteration, the transformation of certain materials into other materials. A common aim of alchemists was a transformation of what they called base metals, like lead, into noble metals, like gold. This is not the only thing alchemy was about. Other frequent goals included the creation of an elixir of immortality, or the creation of treatments called panaceas, treatments that could cure any disease. But the transformation, the transmutation of low-valued metals into gold was often the main topic of experimentation by alchemists. Of course, they could not succeed because gold is not the product of chemical reactions between molecules like other substances can be. It is an element, and in order to turn an element into another, one would have to change its atomic structure, the number of protons inside its nucleus. This is something that requires mobilizing equipment and a quantity of energy that were completely out of reach of alchemists. But even though alchemy was never scientific, it was still a practice that led to experimentation and questioning about what matter was. It was also the alchemists of the Middle Ages who developed some of the first laboratory techniques. For this reason, alchemy still played a role in the emergence of modern science, particularly chemistry and medicine, not so much as a producer of knowledge, but as a tradition of questioning, experimentation, and investigative methods. Yet it is revealing that an entire esoteric tradition took the creation of gold as one of its central goals. This alone shows how difficult it is to regard gold as merely one element among others. Its symbolic and cultural charge is so powerful that it resists being thought of as just another chemical element. The enduring appeal of gold and its influence on history was once again demonstrated in the 19th century with the proliferation of gold rushes around the world. The gold rush is a sudden discovery of gold, and that brings an onrush of miners or aspiring miners, sometimes from the other side of the world. We may think of the largest gold rushes to the U.S., like to California or Alaska, or to Canada, the Klondike Gold Rush, also to South Africa or Australia. But there were many more, including in these same countries, and also to South America, to the Caribbean, or to New Zealand. The 19th century was a time of many of these, due to accelerated geological exploration and the development of transportation, and also information traveling faster than ever before with steamships or the telegraph. A gold rush typically began with the discovery of what is known as placer gold, that is to say, gold deposits found in stream beds. These beds were sometimes dry, which was actually more convenient for mining than working in flowing water. Gold was found there because erosion had carried it away from a vein and deposited it in the stream bed. These deposits could be recovered with very simple equipment, sometimes even by a single person, filtering sediment or digging just below the surface. A few fortunes were built like this by individuals lucky enough to strike gold and exploit it discreetly, or buying the land and move to a bigger operation. What made this kind of prospection so attractive to recent immigrants and Europeans, especially poor Europeans, was that with no experience and minimal equipment offered the hope of sudden fortune. So even in remote locations, all streams and many rock formations were searched for nuggets. Once discovered, however, these spots were quickly worked and depleted. They often pointed to the presence of large gold deposits upstream, either in the original vein or in deeper deposits underground. And that was when the need to move on to larger equipment and many more people, it made it impossible to hide the discovery. The news could spread quickly, and hundreds or thousands of aspiring miners could rush to the place in the hope of finding a piece of land to exploit or another spot nearby. This pattern repeated itself many times in America, and not just in the West. The very first gold rush in the U.S. was in 1799 in North Carolina, east of Charlotte. Then there was one in 1829 in the southern Appalachians, the Georgia Gold Rush. And after that came the most famous, from 1848 to 1855, California Gold Rush, which not only became famous worldwide, but also set a blueprint for gold rushes. Other than aspiring miners, some people understood that money could be made not only in the prospection and mining, but also around them: infrastructure, retail, construction, machinery, and engineering. Even though these rushes were most of the time rather short-lived, they left traces and helped create infrastructures, roads, even railroads, ports. They helped develop entire industries and create towns, some of which later found ways to sustain themselves and reinvent their economies after the boom. This was the case with San Francisco, for example. The city boomed during the California Gold Rush, growing from a small settlement into a major commercial and transportation hub. When the rush ended, San Francisco suffered, but it survived, diversified its economy, and went on to grow far larger. Other American rushes include many smaller ones in the Rocky Mountains in Colorado, Idaho, Montana. For a time, the Northwest and northwestern Canada were also heavily prospected until attention turned to Alaska, with several more rushes there in the 1890s. The last of the great gold rushes in North America was in Canada, the Klondike Gold Rush in the Yukon Territory. That's the Canadian territory that touches Alaska to the northwest. The Klondike is a river in which, in 1896, local miners found gold. The news reached Seattle and San Francisco the following year. In 1897, triggering a huge gold rush that included an estimated 100,000 prospectors. A few became wealthy. The first ones to arrive were the lucky ones, and the vast majority went in vain. The most motivated moved soon after to other spots in Alaska to keep searching. Out of North America, another major rush was in South Africa, and that would become a big deal because in the 20th century, South Africa became a huge gold producer with its mines. For a significant part, this dramatic increase in the quantity of gold extracted worldwide, as I mentioned, the stock had tripled since 1950 and even quadrupled since 1900. This is due for a large part to the exploitation of South African mines. This big South African rush in the 1880s led to the founding of Johannesburg. To illustrate how big that was, in 1886, South Africa did not produce gold, or not significantly. In 1896, 10 years later, it accounted for 23% of the world's output. Another thing these rushes accelerated in the late 19th century and the early 20th century was the use of new extraction methods. For example, in South Africa, potassium cyanide was used to extract gold from low-grade ore. Many new techniques like these, from the use of chemicals to the use of pressurized water to dig veins or rocks with low concentrations of gold, have been implemented and have made viable the exploitation of deposits that would not have been practical or made sense financially before. And there were more of these rushes around the world. To conclude on that, they also played a role in the development and migration to Australia, especially the biggest ones, the New South Wales and Victorian gold rushes in 1851. And again in the 1890s, the Western Australian Gold Rush. In Australia, as in South Africa and United States, many arrived as would-be prospectors, but found little success in their search for gold. Yet because land was available, or because settlement was actively encouraged, many stayed on and eventually became farmers. That move was often chaotic and violent because law enforcement was minimal, and force, rather than right or fairness, determined who got what. And the natives, when there were some living near the places where the rushes happened, were always the losers, with traumatic consequences for them. This peak period of gold rushes is the second half of the 19th century. But even though these past migrations belong to history, it would be a mistake to think the era of individual miners hoping to strike gold has ended. Indeed, it never did. It just became much less visible. There are an estimated 10 to 30 million small scale miners today, far more than at the time of the California or the Klondike Rush. They prospect, not just for gold. Diamonds and other gems are also important. Millions of them are in Africa and to a lesser extent in Asia and South America. Just for Africa, it is estimated that billions of dollars in gold are smuggled out of the continent each year. For a large part, gold mined by these small independent miners, wherever they can, is often out of any legal frame, and this gold transits through the Middle East, like the Emirates, and from there it is reinjected into the world market. So we cannot call that rushes anymore, but with the families and the local spending of the revenues generated by this activity, tens of millions around the world depend partially or entirely on that type of mining for their livelihood. And as I mentioned, they do not mine only gold. There is silver. There are gemstones. But apart from this, there are other precious metals too. So let's take a look at this. So, what constitutes a precious metal? The definition of it is more economic and cultural than scientific. Precious metals are rare and have a high economic value due to a sustained demand for them coming from their use. For example, in industrial processes, or from their desirability as stores of value and use in jewelry making. They are also shiny. This is part of their appeal. There are elements that are rare, rarer than gold, and more expensive than it, too. For example, plutonium is. Its natural concentration in the Earth's crust is 4,000 times smaller than gold. And even though it is not directly comparable because there is not an open market for plutonium, the production cost of 1 gram of weapon-grade plutonium is estimated to be about 50 times the current price of 1 gram of gold. Plutonium is also a metal, and although it could be considered precious in the sense that it is rare and expensive, this is not what we mean by a precious metal. Precious metals must also be pretty and widely recognized as a store of value, often, as we have seen, even in the form of jewelry. This is why the list of precious metals include generally coinage metals, gold, silver, and also copper. Even though it is much less expensive, for comparison, copper is traded by the pound mostly. It is worth 4 to 5 US dollars per pound, around 30 cents per ounce. So 30 cents for 1 ounce of copper versus more than 3,000 for the same mass of gold. That's 10,000 times more expensive. To these coinage metals, we can add the platinum group metals, which are noble metals in the chemical sense. This means they are weakly reactive. They do not readily bind with other elements. As a result, they are chemically stable and highly resistant to corrosion, oxidation, and tarnishing, all of which are consequences of chemical reactions. In this platinum group, we have metals that can also serve in jewelry and be more expensive than gold. Ruthenium, rhodium, osmium, iridium, and platinum. The last one is the most widely traded of them, and again for comparison, 1 ounce at the moment is worth around $2,200 versus $4,400 for gold. But some metals are even more expensive. Rhodium, for example, which can trade for several $1,000s per ounce. It is unclear exactly when mankind started using platinum. Some has been found in the Egyptian artifacts of the late period, the first millennium BC, but it isn't clear whether or not the Egyptians had identified it as a different metal because it was associated with gold, and maybe they confused the two. Also, from the first millennium BC, there are a few examples of platinum artifacts made by a South American culture of Ecuador, the culture of La Tolita. In any case, platinum flew under the radar for most cultures around the world until the 18th century, when it was finally isolated, identified as a whitish, shiny metal that for a time was called white gold. And from the 18th century, platinum has started its slow installation into the group of precious metals because it was found to be pretty, shiny, and rare. But this is still recent compared with the thousands of years of gold, and that's why, even though platinum is well known by the general public and recognized as precious, it doesn't have the aura of gold. I mentioned rhodium, and it is one of the most expensive metals, and because it is a noble metal, it doesn't react much. That's why it's often found either in its pure form or mixed with other metals from the same group. They work well together chemically. Rhodium was discovered in 1803, and its high price come from its crucial use as a catalyst, an element that favors chemical reactions, especially in catalytic converters in cars. It is also used in jewelry to plate white gold with a thin layer of rhodium to improve its appearance. White gold is an alloy. It is not another metal. An alloy of gold with at least one other metal, usually nickel or palladium, sometimes a bit of copper to increase its malleability. Still, the common white gold formulation in jewelry contains 90% gold, so it is rather pure. But in appearance, it will look more silvery than the yellow of natural gold. Another factor behind rhodium's high price is its extreme rarity. About 0.2 parts per billion in Earth's crust. By comparison, gold occurs at around 4 parts per billion, making rhodium around 20 times less abundant. To put this into perspective, extracting a single ounce of gold requires processing roughly a small cargo ship's worth of earth. For rhodium, that same ounce would require something closer to a supertanker's worth of soil. So, between the rarity and the industrial demand and its use in small quantities in jewelry, you have the elements that command this high price of rhodium. Among naturally occurring precious metals, rhodium is the most expensive. But just for the record, it is not the most expensive of all metals. If we include synthetic ones, the ones that do not exist naturally and have to be synthesized. As of January 2026, there is californium, a synthetic and radioactive metal which is only produced synthetically and in very small quantities, 30 to 40 micrograms per year. At this rate, it would take thousands of years to produce 1 gram of it. But still, if we extrapolate the cost of californium, it would be worth around $27 million per gram. A very theoretical gram, given that such a quantity has never been synthesized. But still, if one metal deserved the adjective precious, it would have to be this one. As always, there could be way more to say about tonight's topic, but we have reached the end of our little exploration journey. But maybe now you can let go and sleep. But if you're not sleepy, you can pick another story from my ever-growing library and embark on another adventure. And until we meet again, good night. Sleep well.